In this discussion, we are going to make an assessment of the Congress agrarian policy, the kind of policy that the Congress began to adopt in order to increase agricultural output after independence. Now, any assessment of the policies that the Congress government, whether in 1937, when the Congress was briefly in power in some of the provinces, or after 1947, when they had the real freedom to reorient agriculture, to redefine the priorities of the government's agricultural policy, cannot be made without reference to some of the long-term strains in nationalist agrarian thinking. In the first place, in the early part of the 20th century, the entire nationalist vision about agriculture came to be shaped by the nationalist critique of imperial rule, the extent to which imperialism was held responsible for the destruction of a harmonious rural society in pre-colonial India, greater inequality in rural society, the creation of a parasitic landlordism, landlords discarding their old obligations and putting heavy rent pressure on the peasantry, peasants being exposed to usurious exploitation by the creditors. The small peasant economy, which had been the backbone of Indian agriculture for centuries, as the nationalist argue, was therefore completely destroyed by the impact of colonial revenue policy. And the connection that they established with the market also failed to relieve the kind of financial burden that the peasants had to carry, the burden of revenue, the burden of rent, the burden of debt. So given their understanding of how such changes had actually brought about a disastrous agrarian situation in India, the nationalists had to make their choice between two ways of developing agriculture. Developing agriculture was critically important in the late 1940s and in the early 1950s, in those early days of independent Indian state, because that was the time the planners, the economic policymakers were actually planning development of Indian industry, and without a stable and prosperous agriculture, all schemes of industrialization were likely to be completely destroyed. All their visions about Indian agriculture, of Indian economy, visions of industrialization were not likely to take off without the kind of support that a buoyant industry would naturally expect from agriculture. And the logic is very simple, that if you have a prosperous agricultural economy, the agriculturists were making fair amount of earning, they will generate demand for consumer goods, and such demand in turn would actually facilitate a greater degree of industrialization. So agricultural development, in the sense of a very appreciable increase in output, was a major concern for the planners in the early 1950s. But how does one achieve that? How does one actually allow agriculture to grow? One of the ways, of course, was capitalist agriculture, something that was visualized also in the 19th century by some utilitarian officials here, that you allow urban credit to move into agriculture in such a way that the small peasant farms, which would otherwise become non-viable peasant farms, would disappear, large agricultural farms would emerge, and in a large agricultural farm, it would be easier for people to adopt better and modern techniques of production, contributing in the end to improvement in output. So that was one way of resolving the problem. The other way of resolving this problem, of course, was the socialist vision. Now, the socialist vision was also critically important in the early part of the 20th century. You may recall the discussion that we had on the politics of the 1930s, when Congress had begun to be quite substantially influenced by Congress socialist ideas. People like Jayaprakash Narayan and others, who had their strongholds in Bihar, in Andhra, in certain parts of United Provinces, present-day Uttar Pradesh, where a powerful Kisan movement had already emerged under the leadership of Swami Sahajananda in northern India and N.G. Ranga, M.S. Namboodiripad and others in southern India. This Kisan populism was a very important factor in Congress' assessment of what should be the Congress vision about the reconstruction of agricultural society. And with this was wedded, of course, the Gandhian vision, the Gandhian Rural Reconstruction Program. The socialist vision had something to do with involvement of the peasants in the Congress movement, and increasingly the peasants were becoming important in the Congress socialist.
Sir, how did Gandhiji's vision about village reconstruction actually influence the agrarian thinking of the congressmen?
Your question actually takes us to the persistent nationalist critique of imperial impact, and also that would include Gandhi in Himsa Raj, that you have a harmonious society, harmonious rural society, where people's attitude to their neighbors were not affected by inequality, by greater stratification. The rich peasant category didn't exist. The kind of a vision of a village republic, where peasant families would actually live together harmoniously, sharing the economic resources of the village and contributing to the collective wealth of the village, without that feeling of thine and mine, without that feeling of someone being inferior to another person. So you have this system of village panchayat, which was regulating the apportionment of land. Redistribution was also practiced, as Gandhi believed, so that people who over time would lose land would be compensated by the village panchayat from the common land bank that the village panchayat controlled. So that is the kind of Gandhian vision. And in order to improve on the productive capacity of the village, Gandhians would insist on the use of cooperatives, the use of new ideas, use of new fertilizers through such agencies under the management of the village panchayat. The Gandhian vision is not actually the kind of policy that Congress for some time had contemplated, which was more inclined towards socialism, sponsored and facilitated by the state. The National Planning Committee, for example, which was set up by Subhash Chandra Bose when he was Congress president, with Jawaharlal Nehru as its chairman, thought about collectivization of agriculture, arguing in effect that individual peasant holdings, which were small, usually very small in size in a country like India, it's a land of small peasants, and such small peasant holdings were not good enough for improving on the level of output. So, just in the same way as Stalin had introduced collectivization in Soviet Union in order to improve on the level of output, they thought of introducing collectivization. But after independence, when they got the time, the opportunity to introduce such measures, they were somewhat uncertain. They didn't actually go on with this collectivization idea. Instead, they wanted to preserve the basic structure of peasant economy. This is not the place to talk about the debate that had taken place in Soviet Union itself when collectivization was introduced, between the protagonists of collectivization, who were followers of Joseph Stalin, and on the other side, there were opponents of Stalin who believed that Russia had been traditionally a small peasant economy, and the small peasants were so acutely conscious about their right in land that collectivization, which would deprive them of their property in land, was likely to demotivate them to such an extent that output ratio would begin to decline. That was exactly what happened in Soviet Union. As a consequence of collectivization, agricultural output didn't register any appreciable growth. Since the Congress leadership realized that collectivization was not likely to be acceptable, considering that the individual peasants had their heightened sense of feeling of ownership rights in land, they wanted to create a kind of a halfway house between collectivization and individual peasant agriculture. Realizing that individual peasant agriculture in many instances was not capable of generating as much output as the economy required in order to resolve the food crisis, in order to resolve the problem of demand for industry, because this food crisis also requires to be considered as a backdrop to Congress agrarian thinking in the 1940s. Due to the war, prices were going up, food prices were rising at that time, and to a point where in Bengal you had a devastating famine in 1943. So the concern in the Congress about the creation of an appropriate condition in which output was going to rise, and quite substantially, is easily understandable. But when it comes to set out a policy in order to help agriculture prosper or in order to help the increase in output, this collectivization idea, which at one stage some of the socialists actually found very attractive, was no longer appealing. So what they tried to achieve through the reports of the Economic Reorganization Committee that was set up in 1947, the Congress Agrarian Organization Committee.
So what was then the socialist alternative before the Congress Planning Committee?
Yeah, that is the problem. The socialist alternative before the Planning Committee in a way was collectivization, certainly. But as I was saying, that this particular alternative, considering that it had not succeeded in Soviet Union, was not going to make much of an impact on Congress policy makers, who were setting up by then the Planning Commission in independent India and who were actually preparing the draft for first plan around 1950-51. This collectivization was not, they realized, was not going to resolve this problem. So what they felt needed to be done was a kind of a halfway house between a collectivization process where individuals lose their identity as individual producers and owners, and a system which is basically based on individual initiative, whether small peasant initiative or a large or big peasant initiative, whether capitalist farming or small peasant farming. So they felt that the state might actually do a good deal for agriculture with the ultimate objective of increasing the output, because these people were actually obsessed at that time with the question of output. Social justice, of course, featured, but not so much as output, because they needed to produce more for industry, more for resolving the food crisis. And if the state was to play a very active role in promoting agriculture, the alternative before them was what they thought as cooperative agricultural management or cooperative land management by the village community.
Sir, how far these ideas could actually be put into practice?
It was never put into practice. I mean, wherever attempts were made through piecemeal legislations, those legislations didn't succeed. But the attractiveness of the proposition doesn't lie only in the way in practice it was difficult. It shows how nationalist thought at that time was trying to come to terms with the agrarian problem and solve it. It ultimately would have an interface with what is practicable, which is cooperative. So the point that this whole question about cooperative land management by the village community raised, which featured in the draft of the first 5-year plan, which was one of the recommendations of the Congress Agrarian Reorganization Committee, along with, of course, tenancy reforms, abolition of zamindari, removal of the intermediaries. These are certainly important. But alongside that, they had an idea about how to classify agricultural units into different types of units, and then establish a certain linkage between the government on the one hand and these firms on the other. So they had an idea of actually registering some of these firms which were viable firms, large in size, not so small, viable in the sense of producing the livelihood for a large family. These firms, the government thought, could be classified as registered firms which were obliged to follow the government's directive in regard to use of modern machinery, use of modern seeds, use of new fertilizers, and also at the same time receiving a good deal of government's assistance for the owners of these registered farms to improve on conditions of output. So the government was going to be a regulatory body deciding on how these owners of registered farms would actually practice agriculture with new seeds, new inputs being given by the state, but the government is going to regulate. This is the kind of idea that you have certain farms which can be put in between non-viable farms, some owned by small peasant owners, but also receiving such assistance from the government. So there was a certain vision of improving on the condition of agriculture by allowing the government to play a very creative, constructive, and at the same time an interventionist role in agricultural economy. And at the bottom of the pyramid, there would be numerous non-viable farms, small ones, which then would be brought under a kind of cooperative land management, falling short of collectivization, retaining the identity of the individual ownership rights, the identity of the individual owners, but at the same time allowing the village community a certain measure of control over the manner in which such small strips of land could be brought together to produce a larger farm in which modern inputs could be more easily used. You can use machinery, you can use modern inputs to improve on output. This was not always very practicable idea, for the simple reason that even the small owners were so acutely conscious about their ownership rights even in the small strips of land, even though that engagement of family labor in these small farms actually created the problem of what is known as disguised unemployment. There are a large number of family members who are engaged in agriculture, redundant labor, they were mostly. So in spite of that problem, which the government recognized and wanted to do away with through a certain kind of cooperative system, for the peasants, accepting cooperative over and above their individual decision making in agriculture production was not so easy. So over time, of course, this particular idea, which was mooted at a certain stage in 1947, was dropped. It featured in the draft outline of the first plan. It also was repeated. Lip service was paid to this kind of an idea of kind of cooperative land management in the second plan, but eventually that was dropped. The other alternative was to retain the basic structure and help producers with credit, with fertilizers, with community development schemes which would going to give them better education, better equipment, better infrastructure, somewhat freeing them from the control of the usurers and the rentier classes, superior landholding classes, relieving them of their usual dependence on local sources of credit, offering them alternative sources of credit through the cooperative banks. But this cooperative idea, which is a part of the community development schemes that came to be adopted from 1950 onwards, synchronizing with the Bhudan movement, that wherever you have this surplus land, you actually allow the community, the panchayat and the local bodies to intervene and redistribute this land among the peasants.
Sir,
Yes?
how far these ideas concerning the community management of land address the question of peasants' ownership on land?
Yeah, you mean to say peasant rights.
Peasants' right on land, yeah.
Because with peasant rights were involved peasants' entitlement. Because you have inferior rights and you are a small producer and you don't have that entitlement, you are not going to feel the incentive to produce as much food as or as much as the government would like you to do. So I'll end up by addressing this question, that this cooperative land management idea, which was partly inspired by the Gandhian vision of rural reconstruction, ultimately was unable to carry through this program of government playing a critical role in registering farms and then reorienting these farms towards a new kind of agriculture. Once the government realized that the old agricultural system was going to continue, with small peasants featuring prominently as the bulk of the producers, then the other alternative for the government was to create the basis for a cooperative movement in the local society, among the local communities, without interfering so directly in agricultural production or in the rights of the peasants, whatever they had in those small strips of land. So the other alternative was to create provisions for credit, provisions for supply of fertilizers and other amenities, other inputs required for agriculture through cooperative banks or cooperative institutions. The question that you are raising is also fundamental, because that was one of the critical questions that had been bothering the Congress from an earlier time. Take 1937, for example, the initiatives by some of the state governments, provincial governments under the Congress in Andhra or in Bihar or in United Provinces to introduce tenancy legislations, or to carry out a policy through which all these intermediaries would be removed, and the entitlement of the primary producer to be strengthened by the removal of these intermediaries who actually took away the income that deservedly should have gone to the primary producers. So one impact of this is the consensus that was emerging about the abolition of the zamindar. The congressmen took time to arrive at a consensus because, as you know, between UP congressmen and the congressmen in Bihar, they had different perceptions. Wherever the Congress was actually tied with small landholding communities, it was difficult for them to accept complete abolition of zamindari so easily, as in other provinces where either zamindars didn't exist, intermediaries were few in number, or Congress was tied more so closely with the peasant that taking a pro-peasant ameliorist position was easier. The question of tenancy reforms, however, had to be taken up later, in the 1960s and 70s, through incremental legislations which would impose ceilings on agricultural landholdings, excluding, of course, certain types of property like orchards. But some measures had to be devised in order to impose a certain kind of ceiling on agricultural property. But substantial landholders had their own ways of actually subverting this scheme by distributing this land among the family members before this law was introduced, or holding it benami without formal registration as a owner. And finally, you have this question of landless laborers and sharecroppers, bargadars. And the West Bengal Barga experiment, much later in 1977, tried to address this question of how certain classes of peasants who were producers didn't have any rights at all, who were crop sharers, sharecroppers, that these sharecroppers had to be entitled. A demand that had been raised much earlier during those rural agitations on the eve of independence in many parts of Bengal, when the peasants actually demanded a larger share in the produce. Now it became a question of how to entitle these sharecroppers who didn't have any rights in the land, concrete rights in land. So all these issues of tenancy reforms, which involved not merely the removal of intermediaries, but also to strengthen the position of subordinate groups of tenants, because rich peasants who had substantial land, who were not intermediaries, who were peasant producers themselves, owners of large farms, were also letting out land to small peasants who worked as under tenants. So how does one protect these under tenants? These are critical issues of tenancy reforms, or reforms which were taken up gradually by different Indian states later on in the 60s and 70s. But our intention was to look at the 1950s, early 1950s, and to examine the ways in which the Congress was trying to create a vision of India's agricultural development. Abolition of zamindari was certainly one important ideal that they came to practice. They certainly were conscious about the need to protect small peasant rights, but at the same time, the concern for improving on the quantum of output in agriculture, they had certain visions of reorganization of the Indian village system, influenced as it was to some extent by a socialist vision and to a large extent by the Gandhian vision. So as a moment of departure in the history of independent India, these ideas were certainly important. Even if many of them didn't succeed, they still deserve a certain attention on the part of the historians.